Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome this Sunday afternoon from St. Michael at the Northgate Church in Oxford. Hope your day has gone well so far. We're going to be looking at William Gladstone today as we continue our series of 7 thoughts on people perhaps of interest in history. And it's 5:30, so a warm welcome to everybody. I'm also conscious that for many of us, we may be thinking that it is 805 years today that Magna Carta was signed, and I was reminded, well, in fact, I wasn't reminded because I never knew this, that I think it was at 2:15 in the afternoon, and one of our members reminded me of that. So a big day, 15th of June, 1215. Gladstone would have been very familiar with Magna Carta. William Gladstone in the 19th century was Prime Minister 4 times, was Chancellor of the Exchequer 4 times. At one point, he was both Chancellor of the Exchequer and Prime Minister at the same time, because he felt he could do both. In one of his speeches as Chancellor of the Exchequer, he spoke for 5 hours, which does seem quite a long time, but apparently people loved it. Here we go. He was born in 1809 and died in 1898. So really, he covered pretty much the whole of the century. And he was in politics from 1832, when he won a by-election, not against much opposition, it must be said, until he left Parliament in 1895. That's 63 years. He was very much at the forefront of Parliament and involved. What do we say for 7 things about him? His nickname at one point was the People's William, because he seemed to appeal to the masses in a different way from previous politicians. Also, the Grand Old Man, because he was really quite old for a lot of his political career. He was, as I've touched on, a brilliant speaker. 7 quick things. And the first time we hear about his brilliant speech making was in the Oxford Union. He was at Christ Church College here in Oxford, and he made a speech against the Reform Bill. This was in 1831. The Reform Bill was later passed in 1832. Gladstone argued that electoral reform would mean revolution. And I put this in at the beginning because Gladstone, as a young man, was very traditionalist in his view. Like many in England, he had heard about the horrors of the French Revolution and all that followed, and he was very nervous. He felt things should stay as they were. So that was at the beginning of his career. One of the crucial things about Gladstone, and this is the first big point we're going to make, is that he was someone who was able to change. But at the start, very traditional. Also, and this is currently in the news, so perhaps worth highlighting, in 1833, he was now an MP, so just 23 or 24 years old. That's quite young. And his father owned slaves and got money from that. And Gladstone spoke about the slave trade. There were some demanding the immediate abolition of slavery. Understandably so, we and many at the time might be saying. Gladstone spoke and opposed this. And his reasons were he wanted it to be taken more slowly until the slaves had received better education and how to run their own lives, etc. That may sound very patronizing to us and to others at the time, but that was Gladstone's position. And he said this: "Then, with the utmost speed that prudence will permit, we shall arrive at that exceedingly desired consummation, the utter extinction of slavery." So he's making it very clear that he's not in favor of slavery, but he wants the transition to be taken fairly steadily. It would be wrong to say that he was in favor of slavery. There he is as a young man, making it very clear he wants to see it stopped. He was young, 23, 24, and in latter years, when people threw the comments about why did you want to take it so slowly, it's maybe always good to remember that not all of us are held to account for what we say when we are young. And his first speech in the House of Commons. He changed as the years went by, and he would later say that slavery was the foulest crime that humanity could commit. Then there was some slight controversy because he wasn't sure about the American Civil War, wasn't sure about the value of fighting the Confederacy, who of course were mostly pro-slavery. He later deeply regretted that speech. Again, he was able to change. First thing, he changed. The second thing, he was passionate about freedom. In these Monday series, we tend to base what we look at through quotations from the person. This is what he said about freedom. There should be a sympathy with freedom, a desire to give it scope, founded not upon visionary ideas, but upon the long experience of many generations within the shores of this happy isle, that in freedom you lay the firmest foundations, both of loyalty and order. If you give people freedom, they're likely to behave in a sensible, grown-up way, and you build loyalty and order. He also said, the oppression of a majority is detestable and odious. The oppression of a minority is only by 1 degree less detestable and odious. He was not keen on oppression either in England or around the world. And we remember at this time that the British Empire was growing hugely. Gladstone was very uneasy about that, in fact, more than uneasy. Later on, he made this speech in a political rally. And we need to listen carefully, if I may say, to the words. Remember the rights of the savage as we call him. This is not Gladstone saying it's right to call anybody a savage. It's pointing out that that name is inappropriate. Remember the rights of the savage, as we call him. Remember that the happiness of his humble home. Remember that the sanctity of life in the hill villages of Afghanistan among the winter's snow is as inviolable in the eye of Almighty God as can be your own. We have here a clear statement of human rights of all people around the world, wherever they are and whoever they are. Their rights are the same in the eye of Almighty God as can be your own. So there is no sense that the British people have a right to do all this stuff. In fact, quite the opposite. They have the right in the sanctity of life in the hill villages of Afghanistan or wherever, as much right there as we do here. That was quite controversial. Queen Victoria said of Gladstone, he's a half-mad firebrand. And as the years went by, he seemed to get more and more radical. Part of his desire for freedom, in 1872, his government passed the Secret Ballot Act. If ever we are pleased that we can vote in secret, that's because of Gladstone. Representation of the People Act, 1884, spreading the franchise, those who can vote wider and wider. And we contrast that with 53 years before, when he had made a speech against that in 1831. He valued freedom. He was not keen on war. That didn't always play well in a slightly jingoistic, militaristic age. He said this, the expenses of a war are the moral check which it has pleased the Almighty to impose on the ambition and the lust of conquest that are inherent in so many nations. He was complaining about the cost of the Crimean War at that time. It was slightly unpopular, his stand on this. Later, 1885, considerably later, when General Gordon ended up trapped in the Sudan. He had gone in to do one thing and he'd end up deciding to fight. And there was a big outcry and that the British should send ships and armies to rescue him. And Gladstone hesitated there. Gordon was killed and the sobriquet, the grand old man, was changed to murderer of Gordon. And there are some people in England who couldn't understand why Gladstone hadn't moved quicker on that. Gladstone was to say, we look forward to the time when the power of love will replace the love of power. Then will our world know the blessings of peace. We look forward to the time when the power of love will replace the love of power. Then will our world know the blessings of peace. He said that in the mid-late 19th century, wouldn't be out of place in the 1960s, in the 20th century, and even today. Fourthly, he had a phenomenal mind. He took a double first here in Oxford. He was a superb linguist, classical scholar. He wrote lots of things, reviews, magazines, articles, and so on, including about poetry, politics, lots about religion, lots about economics. In 1870, he passed the Education Act. This is the first time an Act of Parliament has specifically focused on the education of as many people as possible. And Gladstone was very keen on schools being provided all over the country for children of all backgrounds. He also said this: men are apt to mistake the strength of their feeling for the strength of their argument. The heated mind resents the chill touch and relentless scrutiny of logic. Men are apt to mistake the strength of their feeling for the strength of their argument. It is a noble lesson to ponder, especially for those of us who like to get excited about various debates and discussions. Of course, for his opponents, they read this with some irony, because quite often Gladstone would be absolutely passionate and his feeling would come over strongly. He was, as I mentioned at the beginning, apparently an enormously good speaker, an orator, and he would hold the masses transfixed for a very long time as he spoke to them. So he would speak with feeling. He would always argue it was backed up with the chill touch and relentless scrutiny of logic. We may know that Queen Victoria complained that he spoke to her as if she was a public meeting, and there was possibly a little bit of an element of that with Gladstone. She also wasn't terribly keen when he said, all the world over, I will back the masses against the classes. Disraeli flattered Victoria and handled her brilliantly. Gladstone spoke to her a little bit like she was a public meeting, as he tended to with everybody else, but apparently with his family and also with his friends and others, he loved it if anybody would come back robustly. And visitors to his family house would often comment that there were grandchildren saying, "No, Grandpa, that's not right." And Gladstone would love that exchange. He had a very, very good mind. And then fifthly, he was very keen on ordinary people doing things well. He felt the job of politics was this: to make good laws that would make it easier to do right and harder to do wrong. That's not a bad reference point for any laws that are passed. Do they make it easier for us to do right and harder for us to do wrong? He said, be inspired with the belief that life is a great and noble calling, not a mean and groveling thing that we are to shuffle through as we can, but an elevated and lofty calling. And so he would encourage people to look high. He also spoke about cups of tea. If you are cold, tea will warm you. If you are too heated, it will cool you. If you are depressed, it will cheer you. If you are excited, it will calm you. Ordinary people doing things well, he would often fly into much strength of feeling if he felt that ordinary people were being exploited. In London, he would search the streets. He was trying to understand why so many women were sexually exploited. That was misunderstood quite a lot by his opponents as well. But it really troubled Gladstone that these women had ended up in this situation, and who were to blame, and how could that be made better for them. He also cast his net further afield, and when the Armenians were massacred, he spoke powerfully against that. In fact, massacres really anywhere in the world, if he heard about them, he would speak against them. Sixthly, towards the end of his career, there was one topic that would particularly dominate, and that was Ireland. On the 1st of December 1868, he received a telegram from Queen Victoria. He was chopping down a tree at the time. He liked chopping down trees. That was his exercise. Should just say he would always plant a sapling in replace. He opened the little envelope from Queen Victoria. His only response was very significant. She had invited him to be Prime Minister. He continued to attack the tree. Then he said, "My mission is to pacify Ireland." And for centuries, relations between Ireland and Great Britain had been very difficult and very complicated. And it was on Gladstone's mind and heart, and he wanted to try and do something about it. He eventually felt the way to pacify Ireland was to make it free, to give it home rule. And this was his campaign really for a significant part of his latter political career. The young Winston Churchill was taken to the House of Commons and said that he saw Gladstone as an old man, white hair flowing back, passionately trying to persuade the House of Commons that Ireland should be free. In his final premiership, he got it through the Commons, but the House of Lords said no. He was very passionate and he was very committed, but he knew that things weren't always successful. He knew what it felt like to fail. And his mission to pacify Ireland in this sense, to get home rule through, failed. We have had 6 things so far. He was someone who changed as the years went by. He was someone who believed in freedom. He was someone who was not keen on war. He was someone with a very good mind. He liked it if ordinary people were enabled to do things well. He became passionate about Ireland. And the 7th thing is his faith. He was a committed Christian all the way through, and he said these words: "My political or public life is the best part of my life. It is that part in which I am conscious of the greatest effort to do and avoid as the Lord Christ would have me do and avoid." That again is not a bad reference point. What are we called to do? What are we called to avoid? Perhaps to follow the example of Christ in thinking, what would he be doing? What would he be avoiding? I meant at the beginning to hold up the picture because it's good to have a picture. This was Biography of Gladstone written by Roy Jenkins. It's a wonderful book. There are many, many wonderful biographies of Gladstone. Prime Minister 4 times, Chancellor of the Exchequer 4 times. No one else has been Prime Minister on 4 separate occasions. Dominated British politics for an awful lot of the Victorian age. It would seem to me that he's someone worth exploring. As ever on a Monday, we only scratch the surface, so do feel free to go and find out more if you wish. Thank you so much for listening and watching tonight. Very best wishes for the rest of the day.